Hi, everyone. My name is Eric Angel Ramos. I am one of the student members at large for the Society for Marine Mammalogy. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Beth Brady, who is a close colleague and friend, and who's here today to present on behavior-related vocalizations of the Florida manatee. Beth is presenting as part of our series, the SMM Editor Select series, where we picked exciting papers from the journal Marine Mammal Science, recently published in the journal Marine Mammal Science, and bring along the authors to highlight their work and learn more about their projects. Just to let everyone know, we're on Zoom right now. We're also live on Facebook. This video is being recorded live and will be loaded onto YouTube in the next week or two, and then is put as live on Facebook after this. If you have any questions for our speaker, please feel free to put them into the Q&A box in Zoom. It just makes it a lot easier. That way, at the end, when Beth is done, we can go one by one and just read through, and we can tackle each one. Otherwise, it comes in, it'll kind of interfere. So please just put those in the Q&A box. And if you put them in the chat, I will just say, move them to the Q&A box so we can keep track of them. With that, I will let Beth take over. And thank you so much for joining us, Beth, and for presenting for us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here, Eric. And it's my pleasure to talk to you about my research, behavior-related vocalizations of the Florida manatee. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, John Moore and Kim Love. So animals communicate to solve problems in their environment. And though there are multiple modalities that animals can use when communicating with conspecifics or other animals, acoustic communication could be particularly important, especially for animals who live in turbid environments or like forests and such. So one of the fundamental questions that researchers ask is, what is an animal's vocal repertoire, and how do they use these vocalizations when they're interacting with other animals? So to give you a brief overview of how many vocalization types an animal might have, look at animals who live in groups. Animals who tend to live in groups tend to have more vocalizations. So for example, you have the elephants in your upper left. They have anywhere between 8 to 15 types of vocalizations, depending on the author. And these vocalizations can be used for group cohesion, mating, and identifying individuals amongst others. Meerkats on the upper right hand of your screen, they're fascinating. They have 13 different call types just to tell you about what kind of predator they have. So fascinating. And on the lower left, you have rhinos. Rhinos don't tend to live in groups. They don't have a lot of predation upon them since they're such a large animal. They have anywhere between 3 to 5 call types, right? So a lot of these vocalizations that we're seeing in groups let us know that depending on how complex your group is, the more vocalizations you might have. And when we talk about vocalizations, we talk about discrete and graded. And what I'm showing you here is a spectrogram, or a visual representation of sound, where you have time on your horizontal axis and frequency on your vertical axis. So we talk about discrete and graded sound. So what's that? So when I talk about discrete, I want you to look at the vocalization at the far left of the spectrogram. And just imagine that that vocalization repeats itself over and over and over. There's really little variation with discrete sounds. Now, graded sounds are what you see here if you look across the full length of the spectrogram. They have intermediate variations between. So this spectrogram here that I'm showing you is from one animal, and its vocalizations are changing as it gets closer and closer to a food source. So it goes from tonal to more atonal or more noisier vocalization. And sometimes these transitions could mean something different. So just an example is, I want you to think of your dog and your cat, right? Your dog barks, your cat meows, but I bet you can tell by those subtle changes whether or not your dog's barking if he wants to go out, if he wants to play, or if he wants something to eat, right? So these different variations may help give animals with small repertoires more flexibility when they're vocalizing with other animals. So this leads us to the manatee. What do we know about manatees and what would they have to talk about? So let me just give you a little preview about what we know about manatees and why communication might be important to them. So first, let's look at the manatee brain, right? So if you look at their visual cortex up at the top there, their visual cortex is rather small. Now, manatees have okay visual acuity, but for the most part, they live in relatively turbid environments. So visual observations may not be the most important to them. Their auditory section is huge, right? So manatees have phenomenal hearing. They can hear up from 5 to 96 kilohertz, and their best range of hearing is between 6 and 20 kilohertz. So this is giving us our first indication that communication, along with their somatic and sensory or their tactile areas, are rather important to manatees. But what about manatees' lifestyle? So do they have predators? Well, there is some information suggesting that they do be preyed upon on times from sharks and alligators, but this really isn't a big issue for them. Their food source is stationary, right? They're obligate herbivores. They eat seagrasses primarily. And so they don't have to compete for food or cooperatively forage for food. Manatees we find them quite frequently in groups. So when it gets cold, they gather around their warm water refuges, and even in summer months, they'll aggregate at some kind of food source or a freshwater outflow. But these groups are most of the time transitional, lasting only a couple hours, maybe to a couple of days at most. The most strategic thing or social structure between manatees is the cow-calf bond, and these usually last for 1.5 to 2 years in the wild. So we're always wondering, what kind of vocalizations do calves make, and do they differ from adults? So this led me to think about some other things, right? So what about their vocalizations? How do they make their vocalizations? So this was a study done by one of our colleagues. She put hydrophones on the throat and on the nasal area, and she found most of the sound that manatees produces originates from the laryngeal region. So she followed this up with some anatomical dissections to find that manatees have what we call vocal folds in the throat that is used to produce the sound. But why would she put it on the nose? So when you make a sound or when you vocalize, it comes up through your vocal folds and it resonates in the nasal region. So same thing with the manatee, right? It comes up through their vocal folds, resonates in the nasal region. And sometimes when manatees vocalize, you can actually see their nasal area moving. So what do we know about manatee vocalizations? And this is a representative manatee vocalization here to your left in spectrogram. Their fundamental frequency, or that lower square, the pitch, so your voice is a pitch, right? And that usually runs between 2 to 5 kilohertz, so well within the hearing range of humans. They have a dominant frequency band, or where most of the energy of the sound is located. It's usually in the first harmonic above the fundamental. Most calls contain a harmonic structure. These are your harmonics right here. And many calls have what we call frequency modulation. So when we talk about frequency modulation and things of that sort, so we always think that manatees, maybe since they have these selective pressures or not a lot of predation, maybe they would make few call types and alter the structure of the sound depending on the behavior that they're engaged in. So for example, they might make a tonal sound. Here in this middle spectrogram, they'd make a more frequently modulated sound, and then they make more noisier sounds. So one of the first things you have to do, like I said, is define that vocal repertoire, which I did back in 2020. So I recorded manatees in wild environments. I recorded for 24 hours in a couple of different locations, and I defined their call categories. I first did this visually, and then I used some statistics to corroborate what I saw visually. So what I saw first was the squeak, talked about a lot throughout the literature is these squeak sounds, a hill-shaped high squeak, a squeak squeal, which is a combination of the squeak and the squeal right here. So you can see these two call types kind of the same. And then you have your chirp right here. And I'm going to play some of these sounds of what manatee sounds like for you. A lot more high pitched than when people usually think of what a manatee would sound like for such a large animal. So I define their call categories, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's important to a manatee. So one of the ways we can use these call types is to see, and which has my research question, are these calls associated with behavior? So how did I do this? So I used a couple of different sites. One was Portosueno Park. It's on the west coast of Florida, a little bit south of where I'm located right now. It's a freshwater outflow that manatees come to every day, and they use it primarily during summer months. Crystal River, again, is on the west coast of Florida. It's also a wintertime refuge where manatees come for warm water during winter months. Also the area where they do health assessments on manatees every year. They just capture individuals and do basically like a health checkup on them. We have Harbor Branch, that's on the east coast of Florida. This is a passive thermal refuge. So the waters in this area stay a little bit warmer during winter months than they do out in the Indian River Lagoon, but they don't maintain their temperatures for long periods of time like your warm water refuges do. And last but not least, we have Singer Island, which is an area where manatees go to forage. It's on the east coast of Florida, and it's right outside of the Riviera Beach power plant. So I chose multiple locations for this study because I wanted to have a diversity of animals and different sites. So how did I record the animals and how do I record their vocalization? So this is a hydrophone or an underwater microphone, and this was my setup. So inside of this pelican case, I have a handheld digital recorder. This is powered by a battery sled, so it lasts longer than a couple hours. I will enclose all these electrical compartments in a waterproof pelican case, and then I'll put it in a buoy, a yellow flotation buoy. I'll put the hydrophone over the side, and anything that I put in the water with the manatees and a rope, an anchor to keep it in place, I'm going to enclose it in garden hose, and that way prevent any entanglement from the animal. So on the right here, this is kind of what that setup looks like in the water. I also did it from land. So with there, I had a customized concrete block, and I just extended a PVC pipe out the end, and I dangled the hydrophone out off the edge, excuse me, and then had some electrical tape around it just to hold the hydrophone in place. Now, the benefit of this is that I'm not interfering with any manatee behavior. So I'm just watching the manatees mostly on shore and from land, or maybe from a kayak, and I'm not interfering or altering their behavior in any way, shape, or form. So when you start looking at behavior, first thing you want to do is you want to look at how many animals do you have? You want to make sure the majority of your animals are engaged in a similar behavior to be able to use it for analysis. So the first thing I had to do was count the number of animals, right? And then I wanted to look at calf presence. Does calf presence make a difference on the type of vocalization that you might observe? So how do you know if you have a calf? So looking at the image on the right, or the video on the right, you have a calf, which you call in cow-calf position. So number one, they're smaller than the other animals, and they're also traveling back by the flipper. On the right, you have a little bit larger animal, right? So for this, they do tend to travel in cow-calf position, but you can also tell if it's a calf by evidence of nursing on mom, which you're going to see in a second right there. There's some nursing for you. So let's talk a little bit about the behaviors that I looked at. So I looked at 4 broad behavioral states in manatees. I looked at resting, I looked at feeding, I looked at stress, and I looked at playing or cavorting, and I'll get into these in just a little bit more detail. So how did I do this? So I also, in conjunction with recording their vocalizations with underwater recorders, I also used video. So I had video on land, they were synchronized with the recorders, and I also had a second observer, and I also annotated their behaviors as well into a synchronized audio recorder. So I would do this until, all these animals had either about 50% or more of the animals had to be engaged in the behavior. And I would stop recording the behavior if one animal left, so I had to change in the number, if they changed in behavior, or I wasn't quite sure of what the animals were doing. I also had a second observer. So at times, if we disagreed on the number of animals or the behavior, we stopped that recording session. So this is stress. So there I am with the buoy. So what you have is a spotter boat that goes out and looks for a manatee. And then you have a capture boat, which will go out and circle an individual, and they will bring that animal on shore. It takes approximately 2 to 3 minutes for them to bring the animal on shore. So I recorded these individuals while they were being brought on shore. I did this from 2012 to 2018, and I had over 100 individuals. And they normally don't come on that quietly. Normally they get a lot more wild than that. So this is cavorting. Cavorting is more physical activity, more engaging, playing, wrestling, moving with one another. This usually mimics what we call mating behavior, where they have a focal female chased by multiple males. But you'll see a lot of cavorting activity in this area. When you get 2 or more animals in Portofino Park, they tend to interact and play for long periods of time and be very social with one another. Then we have feeding. Feeding was recognized in a couple of different ways. Here you have surface feeding, where manatees are feeding at the surface. We did have bottom feeding, where manatees would go to the bottom and you could see either a mud plume coming up from the bottom, or when manatees would come to the surface, they would have mud on their mouths. We also used dive times, which means manatees would dive to the bottom and they'd come back up to the surface, usually a different location, and approximately their respiration times were less than 5 minutes. So how did I do that? So I would look at individuals at their scar patterns and their coloration, if they had barnacles, and I would use any of these identifying features to identify when each of these individual animals came to the surface. And last but not least, we have resting behavior. So these are animals that are surface resting. They do that a lot during the winter months, particularly in the afternoon when it's nice and sunny out. So they'll be resting at the surface, or they'll be what you call bottom resting. And bottom resting is when they're down at the bottom, they'll come up and surface to breathe approximately greater than 5 minutes, and they usually will surface in the same location where they sank. So I wanted to look at their vocalizations, what those broad vocalizations, if they were associated with any of those behaviors. And then I also wanted to look at these differences in the modulation or in parameters of the call. So like I said earlier, you can tell whether or not your dog or your cat wants to go out just by the way the different changes in pitch. And in science, we actually measure these differences. So I wanted to look at some of these parameters. So to do that, I want to divide their behaviors into high arousal and low arousal, see if there were differences between the two. So high arousal was stress. That makes sense. You're surrounding an animal in a net, right? It's going to be rather stressful. Cavort, where they're physically interacting with one another, and low arousal, where they're resting and feeding and not really interacting with one another. So what did I measure from those vocalizations? I measured duration, or the length of the call, frequency modulation, which you can see here in the middle spectrogram, how that sound goes up and down. And I also measured entropy, which you can see here, which is how much noise is in the call. And then I did some statistical analysis to see if there were differences between each of these parameters that I measured, the behaviors, and between differences based on whether a calf or an adult was present. So what did I find? So first I want to let you know that I based these recordings on one observation a day. So I might have seen multiple observations in a day, but I only used one because I wanted to make sure I used one, and I was definitely knew the number of animals and the behavior. We also did this based on the proportion of calls, because some recordings were longer than others and some recordings were rather short in nature. Those stress-induced calls were like 2 minutes. We wanted to make sure we were accurately representing what we were seeing. So what I'm showing you here is the behaviors, the number of minutes of each, the number of observations of each, and then I have the breakdown of each of the call categories. Now I first manually visually identified these call categories, and then I put it through that statistical analysis that I did for categorization for my first paper that I talked about. So what I want to show you here and what I have blocked out are those 3 call types. The squeak, which is talked about really quite frequently in the literature from most other manatee species. That was the predominant call type that you've seen throughout. The next dominant call type was the high squeak, and the next one after that was the squeal. And those 2 other call types, the squeak, squeal, and the chirp, we didn't really see a whole lot of them. So they were primarily, out of 5 call types, manatees, from what we were finding, primarily use 3 call types. So just to reiterate what they look like to you, again, here's the high squeak, here's the squeak, and here's the squeal. So what did we find with the squeak? So there was a significant difference, meaning there were a lower proportion of squeaks during cavorting, and I'll get into this just a little bit. So this just means that there were other vocalizations there and not just squeaks observed. In stress, we primarily had mostly squeaks, and there were really much of a difference between feed and rest, between the number or proportion of squeaks. But what about these hill-shaped high squeak calls? So they didn't really differ between any of the behaviors, which was interesting. However, they were highly correlated with calf presence. So with each additional calf, the probability of a vocalization being a high squeak increased. So the more calves that I had, the more high squeaks that I had in my vocalizations. So this, that in my observations, so this is the first indication that the high squeak call may be a call that is produced by calves. I hope Eric doesn't mind, but spoiler alert, we are finding that the hill-shaped call, both in Florida and Antillean manatees, is indicative of a younger animal that does decrease in size. That hill shape becomes more flat as we become closer and get longer in length to an adult. So the hill-shaped call tends to flatten out and becomes the more adult-like squeak as an animal ages. But what about resting? So I got to see a lot of animals in some different resting poses, and I kind of like these, so I hope you enjoy them as well. But these calls tended to be more tonal. So let's look at frequency modulation, right? So here you have feeding and resting. Not a lot of frequency modulation, right? A low arousal behavior, we would expect them to have more tonal or more flat calls, right? What about feeding? So I'm going to play in some more feeding video for you. This is an animal that is feeding at Portasueno Park, and they're mouthing some algae off the walls there. So I guess to show you how close I was able to get to these animals. And I'm also going to play some sounds for you of manatees feeding. So what do we find here? Yes, and again, a lot of squeaks, again, more tonal, right? A lot lower frequency modulation, not a whole lot there. So a lot higher from the cavort and the stressed animals. So let's look at cavorting again, right? This is, pardon me, some animals cavorting. Small group of, I think it's around 7 animals that were here cavorting, playing at this time. So what do we find here? So interestingly, we had a lot more squeals, or those noisy calls, right? And I think I have a picture of it here. Oops. Squeals, those are those right there. These noisy calls, a lot more. And let's play what those calls sound like. Oops, fighting. Sorry. Wait for it in a second. Oh, shoot. Okay, it won't play for me, sorry, but they're a lot noisier sounding. They actually sound like you're tracking your nails on chalkboard. So we also found that there was a lot more frequency modulation in these calls. Right, so here's your frequency modulation, and this is entropy, showing there's a lot of entropy in those calls. A lot of squeals, right, are noisy in general. And then we also find some frequency modulation in this. So why are we seeing squeals more highly associated with cavorting behavior? So one of the indications is for other animals, these noisy sounds are actually used in aggression, right? But are manatees aggressive? Well, there is some indications when they're cavorting like that, like maybe they're mimicking mating. When animals are mating, they are competing to have access to that female. So potentially there is aggression, and there is some indications of aggression in captive environments. Another plausible explanation is maybe they're just in a heightened state of arousal. Remember I showed you that spectrogram in the beginning of a monkey approaching a food source, and it got more noisier as it approached the food source? Maybe these noisy calls are an indicator of just more excitement or more energy that they are engaging in. And last but not least, we have, excuse me, these stressed animals. Now, these were the most frequency modulated calls of all, right? So if you see the frequency modulation, they were very high in frequency modulation, most modulation, and interestingly, they were longer in duration than any of the other calls. So these stressed animals more modulated, longer in duration, right? And imagine if you're at some kind of horror picture show right? And you get a jump scare, you might go, ah, and yell out really loudly, because so it makes sense that their vocalizations would be a lot longer. So this is giving us some indications that manatees, just like other animals who don't have a defined social structure or living groups, may use vocalizations. They will use few call types and alter the structure of the sound depending on the behavior that they're engaged in. And like I said, we're doing some more investigations with that hill-shaped call, and we're finding that they are correlated with calf presence. And so thank you for listening to me, and I would love to take any of your questions.
Thank you, Beth. That was wonderful. And we have lots of time for questions. If anyone has questions, please feel free to load them into the Q&A. I saw someone was having a problem with the shared screen. I checked and I didn't see any issues on this end, but if you did have issues on your end, the video will be live afterwards in case you need to load it later on. I had a question to start, Beth, actually.
Sure.
Can you tell us just a bit about how did you start what got you into manatee vocalizations and doing this kind of research? Were you always into that?
Yeah, so I was an intern at Florida Fish and Wildlife for 9 months in their photo ID department. And I had learned back then that manatees had made vocalizations, but I knew there wasn't a lot of research on them. So that's when I went for my master's degree. I originally started working with manatee vocalizations, and then I just continued that into my PhD. So, I mean, 2020, I guess most of when I did my first publication, there wasn't a lot out there, and a lot of it mostly used captive animals. And my study was one of the first that used more wild animal vocalizations to look at and categorize their sounds. So we still need to do some more on the rest of the remaining species. I believe you and I have a publication on African manatee vocalizations, which is just first characterized this past year, which is amazing.
Yes, very excited about that. Thank you so much for your answer. Okay, so I have at least one question in here, a couple comments.
Sure.
One question or one comment. I don't have a question, but thanks for sharing. So interesting, from Sherry Hutto. Thanks, Sherry. A question from Chris Pierpoint. Did you see any interaction between manatees and your hydrophone? Were they interested in this new object?
No, actually, they weren't really interested in it at all. It used to brush over their backs. They really didn't care. Mostly the ones that were interested in it were the ones when I record. I also record in captive environments. They are more interested in that than they are in the wild. In the wild, I really never had any interactions with the hydrophone other than the buoy. They did enjoy the yellow buoy immensely, and they would check that out, but then usually they just go right on by, but they really didn't interact with the hydrophone at all.
Yeah, and I think that it's just, if manatees in captivity, if there's a thing in front of you that's obviously there, like any animal, you're going to mess with it. So I have had a couple of hydrophones like busted by manatees in wild track, the babies, because they just would not leave it alone. So yeah, it probably has a lot to do with whether they're captive or wild, because if they're captive, it's right there and you're probably not going to be able to, avoid having it be noticeable to them.
I've done some captive work, and you have to actually put in some of that stuff at least 24 hours in advance, so they stop playing with it and stop messing with it, so you can actually do some work, because they're more interested in the speaker and everything that's in there.
So with a project that we're working on with the anticipatory calls of manatees, we've been trying to record these baby manatees, and it took a couple weeks for them to become habituated to the little cage and the hydrophone we made, because at first, every time they put them in, the manatee would just come and try to eat the hydrophone. So yeah, I think it does take them a little time to get used to it in their environment before forgetting about it. Okay, another question from Oscar Hernandez. Do they make noise when greeting one another?
Oh, that's really hard to say. So I actually, this is not part of it was part of my dissertation, but I watched manatees coming and leaving an area, and I wanted to know that exact question. Do they greet one another? Interestingly enough, when single animals would come into an area, they would not be vocal. right? But when they would come up and join other manatees, it would depend on what they were doing. So I couldn't localize to an individual. But if manatees were resting, they really didn't increase the number of vocalizations before and after. But I really didn't notice any difference when they were playing either. But then again, I didn't really have a whole lot of samples. But yeah, and when they leave, they tend not to make any vocalizations either, particularly because they're usually traveling by themselves. So the short answer to that is I don't think so. I think they try to tend and engage on what the other animals are doing. So if the other animals aren't vocalizing, they're not vocalizing either, but I can't say that with 100% certainty.
Very cool. Thank you. Okay. Next question from Lucy Keep. Great talk, Beth. I'm wondering if you have ever recorded vocalizations during mating herds.
Yes. And interestingly enough, they are mostly silent during mating herds. I didn't have many of them, but most of the time they did not make they made very little vocalizations. My theory on that is that they don't want to draw the attention of other suitors or other animals to join in. Most of the time, if I did hear vocalizations, it was a calf call who was calling to find mom. So, but most of the time they were silent.
Well, I'm curious. I've seen a couple of mating herds in Belize, and they're usually pretty like raucous. I mean, like it looks dangerous to be near because of those giant animals flopping around in heat. So have you been able, how close have you been able to record them? Like, are you kind of near a big group of them, or what is a mating herd exactly? Is it like 2 or 3 animals, or can it be like 10 or 15? I'm not sure what it looks like.
It can be all the above. It can be from 2 to 15. And those recordings that I got at Portasueno Park, I was anywhere from 10 meters from a mating herd that I have. And most of the time I'm like, where are the vocalizations? Because I thought they would be noisy too, and they weren't. And most of the time, like I said, I had some kind of calf that had been separated while they're trying to mate with mom, and that was the one making most of the vocalizations.
Interesting. Okay. Okay, next question from an anonymous attendee. What are some of the differences between wild and captive manatee vocalizations? I'd also be interested in hearing more about the work with African manatees.
So we haven't really found much differences between captive individuals and wild manatees, although I haven't really looked into that into too much depth. But the paper that I just mentioned, we looked at, that's one of the things we were looking at, because we were looking at animals in captive environments to see how their vocalizations had changed over time, particularly for the calves. And we thought maybe the captive environment could potentially be an issue. They may change the structure of their vocalizations depending on the environment, but we're still finding a lot of overlap between what we're finding in captive environments as well as in the wild. But if they change parameters, so we're not, I don't really have definitive answers, but just for the vocalizations in general, nothing that I'm aware of as of yet. The African manatee vocalization, that paper was led by Athena Rysick and Clinton, please forgive me if Chow, I think that's how you say his name. Please forgive me if I mispronounce that miscorrectly. But they are leading the efforts on looking at African manatee vocalizations down there. And they were finding very similar vocalizations to what we found for manatees. They seem to be slightly higher in frequency. However, we don't know who was producing the call. When you put out a recorder and you just leave it out there for a couple of days, which is what they did in the study, you don't know which manatees are making the call and what age class is making the call. So it's possible it could have been cows, adults, juveniles, calves. We're not quite sure at this point, but it's still really fascinating, and that research is still evolving currently.
Thank you. Okay, next question from Dr. Ahmed Shaki. Can we distinguish between different individuals through the sounds? Thanks.
Absolutely. So there's been some research done on that where they can definitely determine between individuals. There's definite individuality in manatee vocalization. So they do have individual morphology of the vocal tract, which is why my voice is different from your voice. And they have found that in manatees. There has been some work done with spectrogram clustering by Mershon and with Antillean manatees, so they can use that and use similar features of the vocalizations to parse out individuals. There's also been some other work done on that, and still be interesting. So it may be in large groups, it'd be difficult to define individuals, but in smaller groups, you can look at and see that there are slight differences in the structure of the vocalizations and in the frequencies that you can probably define approximately how many individuals are there. Following them over time might be more difficult. As you can see, they alter the structure of their sounds depending on the behavior that they're engaged in. But yeah, there's definitely individuality in there.
Thank you. Okay, I'll take a question from the Facebook Live from Nikki Giogu. Such an interesting talk. Thank you, Beth. Excellent research. Would you know what is perhaps the age of the animals when they are able to make these smooth calls transitioning from more wavy ones? So I guess, yeah, when does that age, do you think, or what time period does that start to happen?
So I'm trying to do that right now at Zoo Tampa. I am trying to follow manatees over time as they progress and over months. And generally, I'm thinking somewhere around the 200 centimeter mark, a little bit before and a little bit after, somewhere in that time frame is when that hill shape somewhere starts to flatten out. And I can't get it definitively because I haven't been able to follow them for long periods of time. There's a lot of manatees in rehab right now, and I don't want them to isolate them unnecessarily just for a study. And unfortunately, that's the best way to do it. They have so many individuals in there right now. I don't want to do that. So, but we're getting a general impression that it's somewhere around the 200 centimeter mark before or after is when that hill shape starts to flatten out and become more adult. That's around the 1 year mark.
Yeah, and I think on that, one of the reasons that Beth mentioned it's that they don't want to isolate them is that you have to generally have manatees alone to know that that's the one that's making the sound. And so recording a couple manatees, it's very difficult to know who actually made what sound, which is why one of the reasons why it's so challenging to study them. It takes a long time to be able to parse out what sounds they're producing and isolate them to specific animals.
Exactly. And the last time I went there, one of the individuals did not want to go into the enclosure or the area to be weighed and measured. So they just didn't even do it. He was so stressed out. So we stopped. So I only had one animal that I was able to record that day. So yeah, they don't do it when they get really stressed out. And I'm not going to do that to them.
That's appropriate. Okay, next question from Chris Pierpoint again. Thanks, Beth. Did they vocalize in response to nearby alligators?
Ooh, I don't know the answer to that question. I read from other studies that they might if they're fleeing something. I believe Tom O'Shea, actually, I'm not sure if they're fleeing from an alligator from his study or not, but I think they might have seen an alligator and their vocalizations did increase slightly when they were stressed. I believe so. But when I had the hydrophone in the location in Blue Springs where there was an alligator, I didn't notice it, but there was also 100 manatees in there, so it would be difficult for me to tell.
Yeah, and just to speak on that, I know that I've seen manatees living very near to crocodiles, and in a lot of the coastlines where they live close to some kind of crocodilian. Haven't seen them interact much, but I know that they must come across each other. But I don't know, I kind of suspect like a big manatee is too big for even a big crocodile to do anything about. But I wonder, they have to interact at some point.
I'm sure they do. I have seen some studies that have shown that manatees do have some shark bite scars, and I'm thinking when they're little, they might have some issues with alligators from calves. I would assume they would, but
Yeah.
Beyond that, I'm not quite sure how much of an issue it is for them.
Right. Okay. Next question. Loaded with questions today.
Yay.
Anonymous attendee again. With elephants being manatees' closest living relatives, do you see any similarities in their vocalizations?
We actually, and Eric, you can comment on this too, we wrote a paper on that looking at manatee and elephant vocalizations. And interestingly, in my opinion, I think they look very similar to one another. An elephant rumble, which is very low in frequency, about 20 hertz, where it's infrasonic, meaning outside of the range of human hearing, looks very similar to me to a manatee squeak. if you looked at them side by side, they look extremely similar to one another. So I think there's a lot of similarities there, but they just are slightly different because elephants are obviously on land, manatees are in the water. Their sounds would not propagate similarly in those respective environments. So if manatees were on land, which they used to be, their sounds would not propagate. And elephants, the sounds of elephants were in water would not propagate. They're too low frequency to propagate in a shallow water habitat. It would be canceled out. You wouldn't see the sound because it's too low frequency. But for so that's probably why their propagation, why their sounds are for the selected habitats. But they're so interesting to look at because they do look very similar to one another.
And the paper that Beth mentioned, our review on elephant and Sirenian vocal learning and vocalizations, I just posted a link to it in the chat. But there you can see some of the spectrograms and what Beth's referencing, that they look very similar and just like separated by the land and sea conversion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so next question from Dr. Ahmed Chaki. On the other hand, can we estimate population size through acoustic surveys in an area?
Athena Reisick just did this. She estimated abundance from vocalizations using manatee vocalizations from Blue Springs. So they were able to accurately estimate approximately the number of animals. This was also done by Fernando Merchan using spectrogram clustering, which is just a way, like I said, to look at similar spectral features to determine how many individuals were there. So yeah, they are able to use their vocalizations to approximately determine how many animals are there. But you also have to keep in mind this worked with a large population with a lot of animals. It may not work in smaller populations. So smaller groups of animals, depending on the behavior that they're engaged in, may not be that vocal. So for example, I had a group, that resting group you saw, I had 25 animals and they were silent for 5 minutes. No animal made a peep. And then you have a group of 5 who are playing, and I had 200 vocalizations in 5 minutes. So that just gives you an example of how it might work and how you might have a lot more animals than what you might see depending on the number of vocalizations that you have. So you have to look at it in respective like behavior and how many animals are there. So it's a little bit of a combination of the two.
Thank you. Next question from David Karen. How can the findings from your studies help manatee ecology with real-world implications?
So one of the first and foremost things are those hill-shaped high squeak calls. So we really don't know a whole lot about a lot of the other manatee species. So just knowing that you have a calf present gives you a huge indication of, right, you have calves there, an approximate age of the calf. It also tells you where manatee habitat, what's preferential habitat for them. If you put a hydrophone in a certain area, you'll know, do manatees go there or not? Is this a popular area? Is this something that needs to be protected? I believe, Eric, and then something that we're working on now, you used manatee vocalization to determine a hotspot for manatees in Belize and determine some of the corridors that they use, if I'm correct.
Yeah, that's right. So some of the work that we're working on with Beth is putting out passive acoustic recorders into manatee habitats in the wild and looking to see their occurrence and their activity rates. And whereas in Florida, I think you have like so many manatees and there's so many, and there's a lot of vocalizations and animals. In a lot of places, there's not that many animals. And so we're out in remote habitats where we can't physically be out there watching the animals. So we put out recorders and see that they're vocalizing, day and night. And some interesting stuff we've seen so far that's actually really similar across a bunch of places we've seen is diurnal and nocturnal activity shifts. And like the one pattern we've seen the most is a lot of activity, more activity at night, less activity during the day. Might be because it's hotter in the day, so you're resting more. Historically, you were hunted more, so you want to rest more in the day to avoid humans. Probably a lot of
boat activity, right?
Boat activity, avoiding boat activity. So yeah, we're seeing some really interesting things by applying, our understanding of manatees making sounds and their presence in an area, whether we can identify those calves to adults or not. And then in the future, looking at those trends over time in lots of different habitats where manatees are, where we don't know. So just so everyone's aware, like manatees live in lots of places in the world, but in the Western hemisphere, they're all across the coasts the Atlantic coasts and the Caribbean, across South America, and they live all across lagoons, bays, estuaries, places, and where in some places where there's only a handful of manatees. You go down to Guatemala or Nicaragua, and there might be dozens of manatees, not hundreds or thousands. You go to Belize, there's hundreds. You go to Mexico, there's probably dozens in certain areas. So you're talking about not too many animals in different places. So being able to put out a recorder, find them, and know what they're doing is super critical.
Right. It just gives you another low cost, effective alternative to figure out where your animals are and where to focus if you're going to go look for them visually.
Excellent. Okay. Next question from Veronica Beek. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I am interested in the sound production. Since these calls are so high for their body size, from the study you introduced in the beginning, is it sure that they are produced by vocal fold vibration? Is their vocal fold length known? And also, can you know which individual is calling by tags or microphone arrays?
Yeah, so that a lot of that work was done for the vocal fold length was done by Nell Marie Giovanetti. And yes, they did measure their, I think they measured their vocal folds. If not, that's something we plan on doing in the future to see if vocal folds increased with age. There's also another study done by Charles Grossman who actually put sound through I think he made it like a plastic replica of the vocal folds, pushed sound through it and was able to reproduce a manatee vocalization. And I think your second question was, yes, can you localize individuals in the wild? Sure. It's difficult, and sometimes if you have a lot of manatees on top of one another, then no. But if you have a few animals that are separated from one another enough, you potentially can do that. Another way to do it is to actively listen to their vocalizations, and you can see where they are in time and space. You have one close to you, then you may like, all right, maybe it's that animal vocalizing and not that one all the way over there. So yeah, there are ways to potentially localize to manatees, and they do use D tags on them as well. I think there's been some studies done with D tags and putting tags on the animal. Again, that's a lot of that work's been done by Athena Reisick.
Thank you. Okay, next question. Actually, let me jump back to the Facebook questions again. Same person from Nikki Giogu. Thank you so much, Beth. Have you also observed what is the earliest that they start producing calls? Is it as soon as they're born?
That I'm not quite sure of, but I think that if I read correctly from O'Shea's paper, Thomas O'Shea, who's done some of this work, it's shortly thereafter they're born, they start to vocalize, but I don't know that from firsthand experience myself.
Thank you. Okay, next question. Let me make sure. All right, from Sherry Hutto. I wonder if they have any vocal reactions to humans. I noticed at Blue Springs, some of them seem attracted to brightly colored swimsuits that the swimmers wear.
Yeah, so that's one of the colors that they are definitely drawn to. So they can see some colors, blues and greens primarily, but those brightly colored swimsuits they can definitely hone in on. And particularly in clear water, they can see probably a lot better than they can in turbid water. I'm not quite sure. So I guess it depends on the animal. Some animals will just flee. Some animals will probably create sound and move away. It's hard to tell. I haven't done any studies specifically looking at the human component and if any swimmers in the water would influence manatees making sound, but it's quite possible that they would. I think it just depends on the individual. Because from what I've noticed, and there's even a study done on this looking at personalities and manatees in captivity and saying they have distinct personalities. So I would think some of your animals would be interested and might vocalize and some might not. I guess it just depends. It depends on the animal.
Thank you. Okay. Comment from Dr. Ahmed Chaki. Thank you, Beth. I hope we can collaborate for dugongs in Egypt.
Me too.
Next question from Morgan Ferguson. Is it known if or how manatees adjust their vocalizations to high noise pollution levels?
Ooh, so I was just I'm actually writing a textbook chapter on, like a book chapter on manatee vocalization today. So there has been some studies on that, just very minimal, looking that they do increase their source level or how loud the sound in the presence of noise. I believe that was done by Jennifer Mixis Olds. They do sometimes Eric and I just did some work in Mexico looking at vocalizations of manatees during tour boat interactions. And thus far, I've been finding they cease communication when the tour boats were there. So I think it just depends on the animal. Like they also saw, Jennifer Mixis Olds also reported an increase in duration of vocalizations when boats were present in the presence of background noise. So I think they do modify their vocalization. So either they don't vocalize or they increase how loud the sound is or increase the length of their vocalizations is what we know at this point.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I can imagine that they have to deal with like the complexity of it. You know, there's boats that just pass through an area. And so maybe you just stop vocalizing and move along and then start again. And then there's persistent boat noise in like a high boat traffic area where you don't probably have an option for that. And you're better off changing, you know, squeaking louder or longer or higher if you need to communicate in that area. I'm sure it's complex. Okay. Let me just double check Facebook to make sure there are no more comments there. I think we're good. Last comment in the Q&A from Zoom from Sherry Hutto. So true regarding the Blue Springs reaction stuff. And thank you.
Thank you.
That looks like the last of the questions. I think this is the most questions we ever had.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed answering all of them. That was great.
That's wonderful. And thank you again, Beth, for this very exciting talk. We really enjoyed it. And I think our community did as well. Just a note, everyone, this talk will be loaded on the Facebook page for the Society for Marine Mammalogy. If you go there to our videos after the live feed ends, it loads up the video. And then we take the video recording from Zoom and we upload it to YouTube shortly after. So you can find it later on. Please join us again in the future. Keep up with the Society for Marine Mammalogy page, and we will post about the next events that we have. We try to have these once a month if possible, usually on a Thursday, with some flexible timings, given that often our scientists are from many different places around the world. And with that, I think we'll end. So thank you again, Beth. And thank you everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all again.
Take care. Thank you, everyone.
Take care, everyone.